Hello everyone, we are here for the second half of chapter 2 of Come See the Fair. I'm going to give you guys a quick recap on what happened at the first half of the chapter and then we'll get going. So she escapes her horrible, I don't know what to call her, mistress who adopted her, and she hopped on a train to Chicago, which just happened to be the one that was leaving at the time, but it also happens to be the one that she needs to go to, so that's pretty magical. She meets a boy on the train named Henry, and he asks her to come back with him to his family's house and go see the World's Fair. They get to the house, they meet the family. The kids say that they want to go to the fair, and then the parents are like, maybe you want to go tomorrow because soon it'll be dark and you're going to want to spend all day there because it's so cool. Alright, so then they agree, okay, we'll go tomorrow, and then that's where we leave off. After a short and pleasant conversation, Ava was shown to her room, an almost implausibly large space studded with comfort. Overstuffed armchairs, fat feather pillows, and a great brass bedstead that shone as if it had never been touched. Iris, the chambermaid, had hung Ava's little bag neatly from the back of the chair, and she explained that if Ava wanted to change for dinner like the rest of them, Ava only had 2 dresses, one of which she was wearing, and neither of which was particularly clean. Then they would be happy to launder what she had on right now. Ava could hardly believe her luck. Dinner was bright and beautiful and delicious. Consommé and white fish and roast spring lamb. Ava couldn't remember when she had ever eaten so well, or so much. And though she was full enough that she thought she might burst, she couldn't stop herself from taking a second slice of custard pie. "I think you shall find the fair quite well worth the trip from Philadelphia," said Uncle Jefferson. "If I didn't have the trouble of work to see to, I imagine I'd be out there with you myself." Aunt Isabella nodded. "I simply can't wait to hear what you think. Willie will take you in the morning and pick you up in time for supper, but you must promise to stick together. The fairgrounds are quite large, and it would be all too easy to get lost." "Quite right," said Uncle Jefferson. "But whatever you do, you mustn't miss the shh." With a flurry of shushing, Aunt Isabella quieted her husband. "Don't spoil it for them now. I want to hear their honest opinions." After they ate, Henry taught Ava a new card game on the drawing room floor, and they laughed and slapped their palms across the tricks faster and faster until suddenly it was very late. "Dear me," said Aunt Isabel with a yawn. "You ought to be headed for bed if you want to make a good start tomorrow." And they all climbed the stairs together. Henry's room was just down the hall from Ava's, and they paused to say good night outside her open door. At first, Ava was embarrassed, thinking that she'd inadvertently left the bed in an untidy state, but Henry explained that Iris had simply turned down the linen to prepare the bed for sleep. Not 24 hours earlier, Ava had been huddled in a corner with a stained pillow on the hard wood floor. Now there was a whole person whose job was to make sure that she was comfortable. She was searching for the words to thank Henry, for his kindness, for his trust, when she caught a strange look on his face. "What?" she said. "What is it?" "Your hair," he said, his eyes narrowing. "It's different than I thought. I'm going to have to draw you again." Ava's cheeks were still burning when she shut her bedroom door. She was used to being looked at every night before a paying crowd. What she was unused to was being seen. It was a moment in the morning before Ava remembered where she was. Iris had slipped in to open the drapes, and now Ava lay in the sun-warmed cloud of her bed, walking back through the previous day like a hazy dream. All her life she'd lived with the orphan's quiet question. What was it like to have a family? What was it like to be at home? And in the blink of an eye, she'd seen what the answer must look like. It wasn't the same, of course, not the same at all. Aunt Isabella wasn't her mother, Uncle Jefferson wasn't her father, and Overstreet House was not her home. But if she closed her eyes and really concentrated, she thought she just might begin to understand. A feeling of warmth, of care, if not quite of belonging. Overstreet House was a tinkling tune played on the same piano as home. But Ava could only linger so long inside this fantasy. There, just across the room, slung over the back of her chair, was her little bag, and she could tell just by looking where the candle taken from Mrs. Blodgett was nestled inside of it. It was this candle and its mysterious summons that got her up out of the bed. It didn't take long for Ava to see that Henry had woken up with much the same impulse. He was up and dressed at the foot of the stairs, and there was a broad smile on his face. "You ready?" Ava nodded. The carriage was waiting outside. Sadie, the cook, had prepared bacon sandwiches for them to eat on the way, and for much of the trip, Henry and Ava sat chewing in silence. After dinner last night, there had been some conversation about where it would be best to enter the fairgrounds. Uncle Jefferson thought there was no more magnificent approach than by water, and Aunt Isabella hadn't disagreed. For splendor, there was nothing like the steamboats. But for the routing, for the best possible path, she insisted that the 64th Street gateway near the Court of Honor was superior. It was beside this entrance, then, that Willie reined in his team. Inside the echoing archways, the turnstiles whirred and snapped. The World's Columbian Exposition was the greatest festival ever mounted. Covering nearly 700 acres of the Lake Michigan shorefront, it featured over 200 splendid buildings that together rivaled the grandeur of any other in the world. One of these, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, was the largest structure in the entire world. Even the ground on which the fair had been set was designed, drained, carved, cultivated. Months before, it had only been a swamp. Now, there were broad lagoons and stately canals crowded thick with gondolas, passenger launches, square-rigged caravels, even a replica of a sturdy Viking longship. And this was just the setting. There was so much to see and do that week-long book-length itineraries were published, touching only on the highlights of the fair. 86 countries from across the world participated, contributing over 65,000 exhibits so varied and far-reaching that scarcely any aspect of the human endeavor remained beyond their scope. There were restaurants, cafes, bandstands. There were buildings representing each state and territory in America, as well as over a dozen erected to represent foreign countries. There was a choral hall where an ensemble of 2,500 singers performed. There were instruments that had belonged to Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. There was even a life-size sculpture of a knight on horseback made entirely out of prunes. It was as if the whole world had been boiled down to a rich, intoxicating concentrate, and for the price of 50 cents, Ava and Henry were allowed to drink up as much of it as they could possibly take. Henry led the way, practically bursting through the turnstile. "Come on," he said, "the Court of Honor should be just over here." On their right, the terminal station, endpoint of 10, 20, 35 tracks, bled more and more fair-goers into the exposition. The crowds grew thick around the ankles of the golden-domed administration building, and Ava felt Henry's warm fingers twine into her own, tethering them together in the press of bodies, pulling her forward. If the fair were a palace, which, in a certain sense, she guessed it was, then the Court of Honor would have been its great hall. If the fair were a temple, which, in another sense it was, then the Court of Honor would have been its altar. Side by side, Henry and Ava stumbled to a halt. "Oh," said Ava. "Oh, my." Great white buildings, towers, domes, an unending forest of columns and archways. The Court of Honor. A massive basin of water stretched far off into the distance, the spotless blue sky glimmering glorious on its surface. At the far end there was a golden colossus, the statue of the Republic, crowned in glory, and for just a moment Ava thought perhaps it had even smiled at her. This place was a miracle. Thrilling, they plunged forward. They wanted to see everything. But there was just so much, and they couldn't move nearly as quickly as they would have liked with their heads craned back to take in all the sights. Here was the huge agriculture building, nearly 10 acres in area, where Henry named the characters of classical myth in the statuary like relatives in a photograph. Circe in her lion-drawn chariot, Diana the huntress, bow in hand. There was the massive peristyle, a double rank of monumental columns pierced by a triumphal arch through which boats could pass through. On the Grand Basin, but could pass between the Grand Basin and the lake. Far, far above, at the very height of the arch, there were letters spelling out a motto, and Ava stopped to read it aloud. "Ye shall know the truth," she said, "and the truth shall make you free." But Henry's head was lifted in another direction. "Chocolate," he said. "I smell chocolate." It was on the far side of the Grand Basin that they found the origin of this aroma. Walter Baker and Company's Cocoa and Chocolate Pavilion, a dainty construction of arcs and awnings. The drinking chocolate sold there was absolutely delicious, somehow even better than the aroma had advertised. And once they'd finished, Henry looked first to the milky brown bottom of his cup, then to Ava, as if he couldn't quite understand where it had gone. They left laughing, licking their chops. Somewhere a brass band was playing a bright march, and it quickened their step, driving them forward into the neighboring exhibition hall. The aisles of the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building were laid out like broad city streets and lit with ornamental street lamps. 5 enormous chandeliers, each 75 feet in diameter, and the largest that had ever been made, hung up above, and the displays were arrayed in elaborate showcases the size of mansions, 90 and 100 feet tall, built of wrought iron and marble and oak. Aunt Isabella had been right. It was just like a city. "So, where do you want to go first?" asked Ava. But this was like asking which part of the ocean one wanted to get wet in. All they could do was wade in. Everything in the world seemed to be here. Henry was marveling at tiger skins and elephant tusks when Ava pulled him away to stumble through the splendid reproduction of the Salon of Louis XVI. Then there was the Guggenblock, colorful Korean military uniforms, which gave way to a display showing millions of dollars worth of gold and jewelry. There were sacred geese of Ceylon carved in rare wood, and a model of a steam locomotive made of silken thread. More and more and more and more and more. At the very center of the building stood a tall clock tower, and Ava heard its bells chiming several times, but she could never tell the hour inside that huge pavilion. Time itself seeming to dawdle, even stop now and again to gaze in amazement at the assembled wonders. The quiet conversation of all the gawking fairgoers floated up towards the high ceiling, and out of the swirling hubbub, Ava imagined she heard a single voice emerging. "Come," it whispered, "come and see." Ava was surprised that she could not recall when she had separated from Henry, but in the moment it seemed natural enough. After a while there was a numbing effect to all the stuff of that great pavilion, sight after sight clamoring for her attention. She'd simply wandered on, following her interest from display to display until she looked up, hours, perhaps days after entering, and she found herself alone. All the same, she shivered when she realized Aunt Isabella had said that they should stay together. Henry? She murmured. Ava could hear the sounds of others high up in the echoing air. Footfalls, the occasional word, but nowhere around her could anyone be seen. Here, a narrow little alley. She could turn along it now, and it would surely lead to a larger thoroughfare or out to the edge of the building. If she could only get her bearings. Ava turned. At the alleyway's end, there was neither an open aisle nor a wall, only an empty exhibition stall flanked by a pair of copper lions, streaky and green with age. The first, on the left, tall and attentive, the second, on her right, sprawled out flat. Between them, there was darkness. Ava squinted, peering into the gloom. A warm breeze shifted before her, and deep in the dim, she heard distinct rustling. The darkness didn't appear to be empty. Hello? Ava's voice didn't behave as she expected. It disappeared from her lips without the hint of an echo. This was strange. What was out there between the lions? Softly, the memory of an impossible voice thrummed through the darkness. Come. Ava stepped forward. The grass was thick here, tangled and tall, and it took real effort to raise her foot with each step. Ava found herself exhausted, footsore, her throat so parched that she thought it might simply fuse shut. The sun blazed down from above, soaking her collar in sweat. If only she could have a reprieve from this heat. In the root of Ava's mind, something rebelled. Was there supposed to be grass here? Had she been in the sun just a moment ago? But Ava was walking towards something very powerful indeed, and as soon as those doubts arose, they curled, blackened, and blew away like dry leaves on a hot fire. Not far across the grass, she saw a double avenue of low, stocky trees. Shade. Blessed, blessed shade. It was just a short trot, and Ava was there, spilling herself out along the ground. The breeze stirred the branches above her, scattering the crystalline sunshine, and the sweat began to cool upon her brow. Gently, Ava flexed and stretched her aching feet. Her mind was as hazy as the sun-scorched air. Where was she going? And where did she come from? And just as she began to pick at the scabby surface of her memory, an aroma, rich and thick, reached her nose. There were peaches above her, slung amongst the leaves, ripe, juicy peaches. Lunging up and tugging softly, Ava pulled a peach from its place. The fruit was heavy in her hand, the color of sundown, and her teeth tore into its yielding flesh, the sweet juice filling her mouth and running down her wrist. Far, far too soon, only the little pit was left in her hand. Ava sat back and sighed. She had never tasted anything so good before, so perfectly sweet and juicy, like a star made flesh. The breeze shifted, rustling through the bright green spearhead leaves. Now Ava raised her eyes to the field beyond the trees, and quite by accident she saw the great house, its roof a mountain range of steeply pitched gables. A cascade of porches clung to its side, all spindly balustrades, I don't know that word, all spindly and lacy spandrels, and a gauzy white curtain billowed from an open window. She knew that house, didn't she? Somehow it felt terribly familiar, as if she could navigate it in her sleep, but she didn't think that she'd ever seen it before. It was vast and rambling, somehow larger than her gaze could take in all at once, and when she looked away, the details seemed to immediately slip from her mind. She had just planted the heel of her hand in the grass to get up and look closer when a voice came cutting through the trees. Ava? It was Henry. He had to see this house, these peaches. Henry? Ava! She got up and trotted back, her eyes scanning the sun-drenched grass. But the moment she passed through the last trees, rooted in their place like a pair of copper lions, the light shifted harshly. Suddenly, things were just as they always had been. She was in the narrow alleyway deep in the manufacturers and liberal arts building. There was no sun above her, just 5 enormous chandeliers. Ava, said Henry, ambling up the alley. There you are. Ava was confused. She had meant to tell Henry, to show him something. There had been something, but now there was not. I think we should stay together, said Henry. The fairgrounds are so big, we might never find each other again. Ava, distracted in her mind, gave a nod. All right, said Henry. It's past noon. Should we get some lunch? Ava agreed, and before she knew it, Henry had led her out through the northern exit into the shining summer sun. The sun reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. I'm starving, said Henry. What do you want to eat? Ava shrugged and let Henry choose. She found with a little surprise that she wasn't hungry at all. In fact, she was completely full. Her fingers were all sticky. She couldn't stop smiling, and she didn't know why. Henry spent the rest of the afternoon dashing from structure to structure, and Ava trailed behind. It was all impressive, all beautiful, without question, but it wasn't impossible. And even the warmth of Overstreet House failed to delight her that evening. At dinner, she still had no appetite, and when the flow of pleasant conversation came around to her, she didn't know what to say. And you, Ava? Said Uncle Jefferson. What did you like best? Henry's answer to this question had been long, overflowing with passion and observation. But Ava could only think of a certain quality of sunlight, thick as honey, sweet as peach nectar. Oh, she said. Oh, it was all so wonderful. Ava didn't linger downstairs after dinner. She and Henry were planning to go back again tomorrow, and she couldn't seem to focus on the conversation. Something was tugging at her attention, flitting in and out of the corner of her mind's eye. Perhaps if she laid down and closed her eyes, she thought, she might be able to put her finger on it. It had the feeling of a dream, what she had seen that day. But Ava didn't have to wait for sleep. It came tumbling out from her skirts as she prepared for bed, small and hard and tawny, all wrinkling and ribbing, clattering across the polished wooden floor. A peach pit. And as soon as her eyes fell upon it, she knew. There was a place beyond the fair, where out of the tangled grass the sweetest peaches grew. And there was a house there, a great and rambling edifice. Tomorrow she would go to that house, and she would pick another peach, and she would walk the halls and eat it and see what other wonders might come sprouting out of that place. It felt familiar to her, warm and strange, all at once. And she wanted to know why. Ava found that she was on the floor. The peach pit was in her hand, and she was squeezing it tight, its mottled edges cutting into her palm. But she relished this discomfort, the assurance of what really had been. Yielding flesh, yellow, rusty red, dusky purple. She wished she had it so that she could eat it again. And all of a sudden, the space between her fingers began to swell and push outward. Ava's eyes grew wide. Her wish had been answered. The peach returning to its pit, growing back, ripening around the stone, hard and small and green, and then larger, softer, heavier, spreading her fingers gently until finally there it was, resurrected, as fresh as it had been when she plucked it from the tree earlier that day. Ava lifted the peach to her nose, the fuzz on its sun-warmed skin brushing against her lips. It smelled exactly as good as she hadn't remembered. Ava began to chuckle, then to laugh, and eventually to weep. No one can deny the magic that happens in their own hand. Okay, wow. So that was a twist. Apparently she can do magic, and she found, what do you guys think it was? Like interdimensional portal. Was that place magic? Do you think it's good or bad? It seems so good. I feel like it must be bad, you know? Like it's the Fae and they're tricking her into eating this. Like, I'm just so curious. Okay, so that was the remainder of chapter 2. Next week we will be reading chapter 3, which is called Root and Pool. Root and Pool. Okay, see you next Monday. Thanks for joining me.